All right, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us. Want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Build versus Buy, Making the Right Decisions for Your AI Systems. I'll be your host today. My name is Malik Sultani, and we're really excited to essentially explore some of the pros and cons of building your own AI system versus buying them from third-party vendors. There's a lot that we're going to get through, and we're looking forward to chatting through it. Just a little bit about Catalyte. We've been working with AI, machine learning, and predictive analytics for the last 25 years, specifically when it comes to talent assessment, identifying technical aptitude, cognitive ability, and essentially, potential fits for a role. So, we're excited to be able to bring to bear that experience. There's a lot of parallels with what's going on in the market right now. So, without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. I also just want to let all the attendees know that the Q&A is open. So for any questions you've got, feel free to post them at any point. At the end of it, at the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. We'll go through everything and hopefully be able to answer your questions. So feel free to ask and engage as we truck along. So I'd love to introduce you to our panelists today. We're joined by Chris Sorrell, Jeff Smith, and Murray Ray. A little bit about them. Chris is our head of AI and innovation, bringing over 25 years of software architecture and development experience to the table, and actually also leading the way with a lot of our innovative technologies like generative AI, machine learning, and blockchain. Also welcoming Jeff Smith, who's one of our architects, and bringing another 25 years of software solutions and design implementation experience to this conversation. And he's been extremely helpful and a great part of our practice when providing AI solutions. And then last but certainly not least, Murray Ray, who's our software industry consultant with over 30 years of building and leading forward-thinking product development and professional services teams. So we're really excited to have you here, panelists. So thank you for joining. And going to just cover a couple of topics that we're going to be diving in today. There's going to be the introduction to the AI landscape, platform consolidation trends, cost versus flexibility, which I'm sure a lot of folks are interested in, architectural strategies to minimize risk and optimize accuracy, and then of course that open Q&A that I mentioned at the end. So, we have seen the AI landscape essentially evolve at a unprecedented pace right now. It's absolutely flying. We're seeing a lot of companies and a lot of players joining the market. And Chris, as the business and organizations are moving forward and trying to essentially evolve with the speed of change right now. Where do you see the AI landscape today, and where do you think it's going?
Yeah, thanks, Malik. I think it's really important that we kind of set the stage with a little bit of what are we talking about when we talk about AI. I always feel like it's a very overloaded term. We say AI and it kind of means anything. So the way that we look at the world, we start with what I call productivity AI, and this is things like Gemini or Copilot 365, and they're typically large scale. They're offering sort of general assistance in information work or productivity, things helping you do meeting summaries or create documents. It also, includes things like GitHub Copilot or other code assistance tools. And these are really around, help using mostly generative AI to create new content or to assist with the creation of content. Then we have concierge, and to me, concierge is really customer or end user facing systems. They're typically providing assistance. It might be shopping assistance or customer service or knowledge base. A lot of times we see those on websites, and I don't like calling them chatbots because that's to me is fairly reductive. And so we talk about them as chat-based natural language interfaces. And these can be, very well executed and very poorly executed. And we've seen kind of a lot of both of those. Next, we have AI integration. And so this is integrating AI services or capabilities into existing systems. A lot of applications aren't AI applications. They just have some AI capability. So you might add language services or an LLM or something in to help with an existing application. From there, we go to machine learning, and really, machine learning is AI is machine learning, and so everything really comes from that. But when we talk about it in this context, it's largely around developing models that are very task specific. So you might have a model that's doing computer vision to track people when they're running, or you might be analyzing, sound to find certain labels or values based on certain features of the data. And so, that also a lot of what we consider predictive analytics is around machine learning. And then, of course, the big one we have here is agentic AI. And I say it's big because it's the big conversation. And this is another one where I feel like it's a very overloaded term. To put it simply, we can call them semi-autonomous, self-organizing functions that are designed to handle a specific task. So you might have an agent that translates from English to Spanish, and you might have another agent that exports that translated information to a PDF or something. And then that's just, the use cases are pretty, wide. And largely what it's about is can we have these systems sort of self-organized to know, okay, now I've translated it, I want to pass it off to the PDF function and do that in a way that doesn't require so much human intervention. The asterisk here is I think that it's really important that we still have human in the middle, because without that, we just have huge risk of failure. And the problem with AI is that it's so much faster than typical traditional processes, that the failures cascade and grow much quicker and larger than you would see in other systems. And then, lastly, we have platform AI, and this is really, you have some SaaS platform typically, and they're bringing AI to the table. So you've got Einstein and Agentforce in the Salesforce ecosystem. Workday has their assistant, and really we'll see every one of the major SaaS players introduce some sort of AI assistance into their systems, and a lot of times this is an extra charge or a upgraded license to acquire those. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage, and then I'll just say, and this is not mine, it's Gartner's, but I think it's a really great slide, because the reality is that AI will come from everywhere. You won't have exclusively build, you won't have exclusively buy. You'll have kind of a broad combination of them. And so the important part becomes, where's the right place to invest that build versus buy effort, and how do you coordinate all those and make sure they work within your framework of AI compliance and risk and ethics, and of course all the systems that they integrate with. So I think this is a place where I'd like to maybe toss it over to Murray. How do you see this in terms of where AI fits within our existing systems, and how we're going to sort of move forward?
Well, sure. A lot of the software vendors these days have jumped on the bandwagon in a big way and talking about how they're putting AI embedded into their products. And I think they're telling a good story by doing that, as opposed to trying to sell AI individually, because really what we're looking at here is what business benefits are we ultimately going to get from this, right? Whether it's coming from a software vendor itself, whether it's coming from the business and they're saying they need AI to solve their business problems. Really, what it comes down to is, at the end of the day, they're meeting the center of, are we actually solving business problems? And that's why I think you're right here. AI will come from everywhere, because everybody's trying to solve problems.
Yeah, and I think what can be very challenging about this is, how do we measure success? If we have AI in everything, if it's coming in everywhere, how do we know that it's being successful? How do we know that the cost that we're incurring for that is actually generating any kind of return? And I think that's something that we're everybody's kind of struggling with. What are the right measurements for that? Jeff, do you have any ideas about that?
The notion of it coming from everywhere is it really speaks to the rate of change that's happening in the industry, and it's something that is it should not be underestimated. The amount of change that's occurring is occurring in a unit of scale of weeks, weeks and months, not yearly, and so trying to keep up with it all is a struggle that is it's real, and it definitely needs some attention.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of a good segue. I was recently at the Gartner Data and Analytics Conference in Orlando, and it was when I was walking the floor, what really struck me about this is how many of the vendors were focused on AI. And so I just went back and did some counts. And of the vendors, these were the top 5 categories. And you can see the majority were AI, generative AI, and around data and analytics, and in particular around governance for AI or preparation for AI. That was the conversation that was being had. And that I think really speaks to the very rapid influx of vendors and capabilities. And I think that conversation is different now than it was a year ago, when most organizations were kind of dabbling their feet in a little bit and saying, hey, is this the right thing to do? Do we do a pilot? Now every company has sort of figured out AI is involved in their future plans, and they're trying to kind of figure out where do these things fit, and how do I get value from them. So, with that, I think one of the things I really I want to sort of bring this back to that this type of cycle is not unusual. We've seen this before, and a couple of them that I think of a lot. So if you think of the sort of the mobile phone revolution, if you will, I mean, when you started out with mobile phones, there was 1 or 2, and then there was suddenly 40 different brands of phone, and whether you had a Nokia or like a StarTAC or whatever, and I'm dating myself a little bit here, but there was huge innovation, all kinds of operating systems and user interfaces, and now we have essentially Android and iPhone, right? And so we see that cycle of innovation, expansion, a ton of entrants, and then we see them consolidating, some winning, some losing, some are failing. And that's really going to continue to be the case. This is very similar with the World Wide Web. Everybody had to have a website, and whether you used hot metal or some other system to build it, now we kind of all have WordPress. So that's just to say that cycle kind of continues. And Jeff, what do you think about that? Where do you think we're at in that cycle?
It's interesting to watch the low no code platforms continue to evolve. I think back to a time before AI, actually, and before AI we had SharePoint, and it was a glorious thing. This is maybe, I don't know, early 2010s or so, and as a developer, we could create solutions by clicking through the creation of some content types and list configurations, and voila, it was instant hero. But this created a little bit of attention, though, for developers, because we were developing solutions that didn't require our beloved compilers, and it was kind of an issue for us. From that, though, it gave rise to the notion of a development mantra affectionately named as the 3 C's. It was configure first, customize next, and code last. You see, it was only as a last resort that we would reach for Visual Studio and start deploying some server-side assemblies. The key lesson, though, at the time was that not all problems required code, and that was that was a shift in paradigm, that's for sure. Especially when in 2014, Gartner coined the term citizen developer. It was at a time when the low no code tools officially gained traction and entered the mainstream. And in reflecting on it, really, that same wave of democratization that occurred then is now happening in AI. Whereas where the low code stopped being cute and cute with air quotes, and instead became business critical, AI has moved from from a novelty to a necessity. It's not a prototype anymore, and it's really part of the platform. Indeed, I'd argue it's the heart of the platform.
And I think, you're talking about the low code. That was something that was very remarkable. Again, walking the floor at Gartner, was how many of these systems were sort of drag and drop. And I, as a developer, it always sort of makes me anxious because I want to write code. But there are some use cases where that type of system is perfectly acceptable. And so, we do a fair bit with the Microsoft Power Platform, and that's a great scenario for that type of. You have a common use case to build an app, you can do it quickly. And, so where I think it's the challenge with it is a lot of these systems have the configure and customize, but they don't have the code. And so, when I'm thinking about entering into the market with one of those systems, or when I'm thinking about buying one, do I have some sort of a model to be able to code against this if I reach the limitations or the end of that system's capabilities? And so I think that's, an important criteria if you're looking to buy one. And then, so I'll move on. I'm gonna sort of show these hype cycles real quickly. What I wanted to point out here is just that this Gartner's hype cycle is kind of a proxy for where the industry's at with a given tech. And so kind of on the left side, you have a lot of innovation, a lot of new entrants, a lot of new players and new patterns. And as they start to move over into what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment, what you see is some of those businesses failing, some of those platforms getting consolidated or purchased, and a lot of pattern establishment comes out of it. And then you ultimately have some very mature patterns that everybody accepts. And so SharePoint's a great example of that. SharePoint is SharePoint. It's totally baked in that as a sort of, document management and system. Like, those patterns are very well established. And that wasn't the case, of course, when SharePoint first came out. And so, the point here is just that if we look at really any of these, we're still very much in that innovation phase, but we are starting to move into the trough. And where that I think becomes important when we talk about build versus buy is, we have to think about if the platform we're buying into or the technology we're building on is going to be there in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and are we willing to make that investment with that risk? And that's not to say you should or shouldn't, but just that there's a evaluation you need to do there. What do you think about that, Murray?
Yeah, this really reminds me of my first software company back in the late 90s, where the internet was really taking off and everybody was hyped about everything. Company valuations were out of this world. And then within 2 years, I mean, everything pretty much had consolidated down into the winners and the losers. And the excitement right now sometimes can cloud which vendors are really going to end up being the winners and losers. And I think this graph and the last graph really does a great job of it, kind of showing you where things are at and how much risk and uncertainty exist in some of the earlier stage companies right now.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of, and this is not to criticize them at all, but there was a period of time where you either had K2 or Nintex for your process automation, and you pretty much don't have those anymore because they've become sort of replaced by other things, and in particular things like AI, robotic process automation, and things like that. And so it's really important to just sort of understand that and take that as a sort of going in assumption. If I'm going to buy on this platform, I have to recognize that there's risk right now at the point that we're at.
So, that kind of, I guess, brings us to, we've been talking about some of the consolidation pieces, and as the market is maturing and we're seeing a lot of these companies acquire some of the smaller startups, there's always a trade-off to things. So, is this consolidation a concern right now? Do you see it as a concern today? Or, you mentioned in a couple of years, some of these companies may be completely irrelevant. If you don't mind just spending, I'll open this up to the panelists, just a minute or two on that.
Yeah, I think it's a risk. It's not it shouldn't be a dissuader. It's not a problem that would keep you from the market. But I think the thing to recognize here is there's a lot of overlap in functionality, and there's platforms. A lot of these platforms are looking to be acquired, especially the smaller ones, and so they might be looking for that unicorn that's going to buy their product and suddenly make them relevant. And so there's some due diligence to be done there. And I, at this point, wouldn't be sort of inclined to put all my eggs in one basket. What about you, Jeff?
Yeah, in fact, should be definitely proceeding with caution, in my opinion. The consolidation, I think we're at an. It feels like we're at an early stage, but it's occurring now. I was listening to a podcast over the weekend with Brett Taylor was his name, or is his name, former CEO, co-CEO of Salesforce, the CTO of Facebook, former CTO of Facebook, and an entrepreneur. I mean, the point is, they were talking about AI and it as being the next frontier. And he, in his explanations of some of the topics, he was specifically in terms of model consolidation that's happening. He described an interaction that he had with an investor, and a model investor, in fact, and this investor described the models in particular, AI models in particular, as being the fastest depreciating asset of all time. And that's because of, one, the rate of change, and also because of the consolidation that we're starting to see happen now. It's pretty stunning. It's a pretty bold statement. I don't know how well that's backed up, but to hear that coming from some pillars in the community, I felt was pretty significant.
Yeah, and I think that's, it speaks to that rate of change too. There's a new model literally every day, if not more often. And so trying to figure out, is it worth jumping to this new one? Do I go to the next OpenAI, or is, the 4.0 good enough? Do I switch to DeepSeek or a small language model? And, I was playing around with Phi 3, Microsoft small language model, and before I could even get it into a production system, they had Phi 4 out. And is it worth the investment? Those challenges they can really lead to some analysis paralysis. And so, I think when we talk about models, most of them are good enough for most use cases now. If you have a really specific use case that is sort of a challenge maybe for an LLM, you would want to look for models that are really well designed for that. Some of them are better at math or logical reasoning, or image generation, or whatever those things are. But in general, if you choose the latest Llama chat LLM versus the latest OpenAI one, frankly, you're kind of, it's going to be more a question of what's the best fit for your tech stack and your capabilities and your environment.
I think that kind of leads into another one of the topics as far as that cost versus flexibility in bespoke AI solutions. And I know that they'll come with higher initial costs, but obviously there's going to be a little bit more flexibility, allowing businesses to tailor their system as well. So there's also a pretty interesting stat that I thought I'd throw out there, where enterprises are using an average of 9 different AI tools across departments, and that's from Forrester. So, that's a lot of money is being spent. So I'd love to open it up to the panel and see what your thoughts are, and how kind of this applies to AI, the cost versus the flexibility.
Yeah, I'm going to just sort of set the stage to say, the build versus buy conversation is the same as we've always been having. Build brings customization, competitive differentiation, IP ownership, flexibility, things like that at a higher cost, right? So buy brings lower costs, faster time to value, benefit of sort of the other customers' testing and feature requests. And so none of that really changes because we're talking about AI. So as we were kind of brainstorming about what we wanted to talk about, we were really kind of pushing it, what is different about AI in those considerations? And so this is kind of just a bit of a graph of some of the places where we think there's the most risk and the most challenge and things we need to think about. So I'm going to throw it over to Murray. What's the one that you think is kind of the most important here?
You know, I don't know if I could say there's one most important one. I think there are, like you've identified here, considerations, and each business and each problem is going to have different considerations. The big thing, of course, I think is really at the end of the day, what sort of work are we doing? What are we automating? What business problem are we solving? And so if I was going to have to pick one, I would look at the integration with human workflows to see how your AI solution is both augmenting what humans can do individually, perhaps even replacing or expediting the work that individuals are doing, and allow individuals to concentrate on the higher value types of things. So looking at that, when you look at workflows, you really are looking at what the business is doing. And the closer you get to the business, the harder it is to buy a solution. So that's really kind of what my view is that based on the problem I'm solving, I have different sets of criteria, and based on that business problem, I'm going to choose different options.
Yeah, I agree. And I saw Jonathan said, it's worth noting that the cost of building can be competitive as well because of how many open source models are available. And I think that's true. I think you enter into a whole different set of problems when you try to take that on as a sort of architectural pattern. If I'm, spinning up a open source model, maybe I'm running it, in a Kubernetes environment on like Hugging Face or something like that. There's an infrastructure cost, there's a compute cost. And so you're sort of transitioning from sort of, request-based costs to infrastructure costs. And those are, there's certainly concerns around that. But I do agree that, some of these open source models are making it hard to justify the spend on one of the bigger models like OpenAI or Llama.
Can I just say real quick? I was looking at Hugging Face yesterday, and they're currently advertising over 900,000 models as being available to choose from. I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know how verifiable that is, but that's a stunning number just in the models. So take that for whatever it's worth. This is one place, and this is all models that have been cooked. If you want to go build some models on top of that or instead of that, the equation starts to change pretty significantly too.
I think I want to call out here with all of those models, the one that always sort of gives me nightmares is response accuracy. And that's one that, most organizations are really trying to dig into. We've all seen the huge failures of some of the public AI chatbots telling people to put rocks on pizza or, giving away discounts that they're not authorized to give out. And so, all of that is really sort of one of the challenges, and this is particularly true for LLMs, is that they don't know right versus wrong, correct versus incorrect, accurate versus inaccurate. It doesn't have that sort of qualitative ability to evaluate. All it knows really is that for the given prompt, these are the most statistically likely tokens in the most statistically likely order. And I always like to tell this story of when I first got into playing with like ChatGPT, I put my phone number in and I asked, is this a prime number? And ChatGPT was like, yes, it is. And I was super excited about that. And then I went to a prime number checker and it very much wasn't a prime number. And, and what's important to understand about that is that when I asked that question, it had basically a 50-50 chance of yes or no, in terms of the next most likely token, and it picked the wrong one. And then it created a whole string of information out of that one incorrect token, right? And so that's when we talk about hallucinations, that's a huge challenge. So there's some techniques for doing this. Where I think this is important is if you're going to build a platform, you have to code around those use cases or those edge cases and think about them and manage the prompts that the system's allowed to handle. If you're buying a system, you absolutely need to understand what capabilities it has around accuracy, what its model is it going to use RAG, or is it going to use fine tuning and, human reinforcement learning? You got to understand that, because all of that's going to drive the accuracy of your responses.
Well,
I guess if I were to go ahead.
Oh, please go ahead, Jeff.
No. I guess if I was to camp on a category here, I think I'd set up shop in the data neighborhood, the data availability and ownership. And I feel that way because unique to the AI space is the data. It's not. It really is the product. Traditionally, data flows through a solution, but in AI solutions, data is the solution, and that really so much in my mind anyway. So much hangs off of that, and really underscores the importance of the quality, the breadth, and uniqueness of your data is really a competitive differentiator. And before going down the build versus buy question in terms of data, I guess it would behoove everyone to really verify the readiness of your data before even starting to make that decision. Readiness assessments are there's plenty to choose from, but that would be, I guess, maybe a word of recommendation. For the build scenario, having clean, verified data is an absolute must. You just can't out-engineer bad data. And in terms of buying it, being aware of if and how a vendor uses your data, that is for training, is a significant consideration. If you're going to go buy and your vendor is using your data to train, there's a lot of overlap there for other folks, perhaps your competitors, that are buying from the same shop, and is where your data is being used to train the model that they're using. So food for thought with that.
What you talked about there about sort of the data quality, there's another aspect to it, which, if you, for example, were to just point an LLM at a transactional database or something, it's not going to be able to do analytics.
Yeah.
It doesn't know how to do analytics. And so, you either are building an AI model that's doing the analytics for you, or, you have whatever, maybe you've got some Databricks or something that's running to do analytics, and then you can produce something that is, readable by something like an LLM, right? And so I've seen use cases of essentially taking analytics data and exporting it to a PDF, and then bringing that into a vector database where it's now readily available for an LLM. So you have to think about what's the format and information you want your AI systems to have, and you have to get it there. And there's not, so far, there's a ton of entrants in trying to get it there and get it prepared and governed. Not a lot of organizations maybe can't afford that. And just lastly, I want to say, if you have a sort of really small but critical data set, it can be challenging to get it. Let's say, again, I'm leaning on chatbots and LLM, but it can be really difficult for it to be accurate, because the quality of the statistical analysis that's generating the tokens is based on the volume of occurrence, right? So the more information you have, the more likely it is to evaluate that as good. And so for smaller organizations who might want to do like an AI chatbot or something that leans on their source material, you might need to investigate some alternative patterns to actually get the level of quality that you want without having to spend a huge time doing fine tuning and reinforcement learning to get it there.
So, Chris, we've talked a lot about, some of those kind of costs and direct costs and whatnot, but I'm curious, and I think everyone here is, do you build or do you buy? But we'd love to hear just some kind of recommendations, and what are some of the other costs that we should be thinking about, or folks should be thinking about, between a bespoke solution versus a platform product?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do that, I just want to say really quickly, a couple of other ones that we think of. Risk. AI just has a significantly higher risk because it's a probabilistic system. There's certainly a talent shortage right now, so that's a concern if you're trying to build a team with that capability. And then the last piece is just like we were talking about, the 900,000 models. How do I pick it? right? And so it's really easy to get caught into analysis paralysis. And that's where I think the important thing is to just decide your metrics up front. What are you trying to measure? And then measure it and evaluate it. And then you can make decisions from that. It wasn't good enough. We need to choose a different model or whatever. But it is not worth waiting and hanging on, because it's frankly not going to get better for quite a while. So then moving on to your question here, when we talk about the build versus buy from a cost standpoint, the first thing is it's a lot of times sort of a CapEx versus OpEx conversation. If you're building, that's typically going to be a capital expenditure, at least for the implementation part of it. You may not have that that capital to spend, or that may be advantageous for you for whatever your accounting reasons are. The operational expenditures are certainly easier to sort of budget for and plan for. We have to pay for 10 licenses a month for this product for the next however long. And that's really just, every organization has a sort of a different stance on that. The next piece, and I think this is really important, is to understand how these are typically costed, how the costs are generated. And so in the buy world, that's typically kind of a per seat license. So for example, with Copilot 365, you buy a $30 per month license, and that allows you to do sort of unlimited operations and transactions against Copilot 365. The point there is that an individual user could use a significant amount over what the cost is, or what the value is there. They're counting on it being made up by a lot of others who aren't using it as much, right? And so if you're doing it on a per seat license basis, you really need to think about, am I getting the most value out of this? Because they're frankly not cheap, and I don't think they're likely to become cheap anytime soon. On the other hand, if you're doing build, then you're really talking about sort of consumption-based or infrastructure-based costs. And consumption-based, if you're using, let's say, inference as a service, or some of the language translation services or something, they're either going to be on a per request basis or on a per token basis. And tokens can be sort of challenging to calculate in terms of the cost. And it's really important to spend some time there and try to come up with a real estimate of, per session, how many tokens do I expect to have this system use? And it will surprise you. You think it's going to be 300 and it's 9,000. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I know, Jeff, you've done some work around that. What's your experience with it?
Right. Recently, we've implemented a solution for customer, and the cost factor is, as it always does, came up, and which boils down to the token count, the token usage. In essence, it's the most atomic unit of measure, and that's how it's built. And so we implemented a solution to log that information, so that there was session history, for example, was used to track users' interactions with the solution across sessions, noting, of course, the questions and the answers and so forth. But along with that, and more to the point, was the logging of the token usage coming into and going out of the model, which gives a pretty fine level of granularity in terms of the visibility for the associated token costs. Because you could take those token counts then and plug them back in the model, in the calculators or estimation tools, and come to a more concrete understanding of what those costs are going to be going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of to that point, build, you're always going to be better able to fine tune to control costs. With buy, the costs are predictable. What I would say is it doesn't necessarily scale well. It's again, and I'm not picking on Copilot, but a $30 per seat per month cost is not trivial. And when you multiply that by 100, 1,000, 2,000, 20,000, you're talking about, incredible amounts of money. And so you have to think about that, especially with some of the smaller players where, it's not as big as like Copilot in terms of its capability and breadth of functionality, are you actually getting the value out of 200 seats of this platform? And again, I can't answer that directly, but it's an evaluation you need to make. All right, so I think from here, the real question and that I think people are here for is, what should you build versus what should you buy? And so I'll say here, there's never going to be one answer for this. Every organization is going to have a different sort of decision matrix around this. But the way that I see the world, and I think hopefully the way that we at Catalyte see the world, starting with kind of what to build, concierge systems are, to me, a really great place to build. And the reason for that is because everybody I've ever talked to that wants a chatbot or a concierge system, the first thing they're concerned about is what if it says the wrong thing? And so if you build it, you have much, much more granular control to narrow the scope, to implement a walled garden, which is to say, kind of limit what functionality it has access to, what information it has access to. And again, if you pick something like Copilot or Gemini or something like that, you could use them to build a public facing chat interface. It has access to all of your information, all your corporate data that it can see, it knows of. And so your risk there is considerably higher for data exfiltration and things like that. So to me, concierge today is absolutely a build. Machine learning, I would say, is a build too. And the reason for that is there's so many models out there that are perfectly valuable or useful for a lot of use cases. And so if none of those fit, then you really need to be looking at building your own. You have such a unique use case that you really have to, build to suit. And so there are plenty of places where you might buy or use a model, an ML model. I don't really consider that to be build. I consider that to just be, sort of using what's out there. But again, with machine learning, if you get to a point where there's no model that can predict accurately what you're trying to predict, you're going to want to build that. And then agentic AI, I think there's a huge number of platforms out there that are telling you we're going to build AI agents, they're going to automate everything for you, they're going to make it magic. I have huge concerns about the risk of autonomous systems and the oversight, and a lot of those are sort of point and click systems to build these agents. And this is a place where, to me, I would much rather have the narrow scope and reduce that risk by getting my hands on code versus trusting a system that's out there. On the other hand, for what to buy, productivity AI, you're never going to build that. There are some, for example, open source models that do, code assistance. I can't see the value in implementing one of those in most cases versus something like GitHub Copilot. And the sort of where productivity AI is going is it's going to be table stakes, and it's really going to be whatever platform you're most aligned with. So if you're a Google shop, you're never going to use Copilot 365. And likewise, if you're Microsoft, you're not going to use Gemini. And if you're Oracle, you'll use theirs, or IBM, right? So basically, it just comes down to they're battling for feature parity. You're just going to pick the one that is closest aligned with your stack and your office environment. And that's just the table stakes of tomorrow. And then I would say, when we talk about AI integration, it's hard for me to justify, again, like that infrastructure cost and the maintenance and the build around something like, let's say I wanted to do translation services, when I can just integrate with Azure Language or, computer vision, where it's got models built in for ingesting forms and stuff. So most of the use cases I see for integration of AI into existing systems, just buy the service and then build it into the product.
Well,
okay, so that's kind of that bit. Where are we at?
Chris, I think, we've got a few minutes before we actually open up to Q&A, but this kind of brings up, you brought up walled gardens and some of the architectural strategies to minimize that risk. I personally love the concept. If you could just kind of quickly talk about it? I know it's been around for a while and how it relates to AI. That would be great. Just a couple minutes.
Yeah, and I wish I could spend the entire time on this. This is a little bit of the how the sausage is made here, but what I want to talk about is two things. First off, when we talk about a walled garden, traditionally that's a risk, right? We've got data silos, we've got systems that can't interoperate. That's a problem. When we talk about AI, to me, it's really important because the data is an input to AI, and we want to limit that input. Of course, garbage in, garbage out, plus the sort of risk of if it has access to things it shouldn't have, like my financials, it will expose those. It absolutely will. And so whether, regardless of the build or buy, you absolutely want to kind of wall your gardens. And so you can see here we've got, for example, maybe we have some document sources and we are going to index those into like a vector database, so that we are limited to just the relevant document sources. We might be doing something like I talked about with analytics, where you have some pipeline of analytics that produces some documents that can then be indexed. You might have some retrieval augmented generation or RAG going against like databases or apps. And you can see here, we have control by using like a serverless function or a REST API sitting in front of those systems. So we have very granular control over what it has access to. And then the thing I'll kind of note here is for a lot of, and I'll say just sort of generative AI, that whatever that is that you're getting, whether you're getting it from a vector database or analytics or some other RAG pattern, you want to pass that to your model. I don't recommend any system being opened wide open to using its training data, because that's where you get those really bad hallucinations. And I wish I could talk more about it. I have some other patterns to talk about, but I'm being told we want to wrap up here. So I would definitely, say ask questions or reach out to us and I can talk more about these.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, team. We definitely wanted to make sure that we address some of the questions that came through, and we've got four. So, kind of use this time to ask any additional questions, and I'll throw out the first one. As well as this is from Sam Hoppert, is how do you build an AI system that won't be obsolete in 6 months?
There's an old object-oriented adage that goes something like, if I remember it right, you want to abstract away that which may change. And that's some OO speak for modularity, modularity, modularity. I think that addresses this pretty succinctly. If could you, Malik, could you pop that architecture slide back up real quick, or is it Chris? Whoever's running? The right there in the center, that orchestration piece, with the purple dots spreading out. Really, to me, it visually represents the modularity and the value of the modularity. If all these things in the AI space are going to change, well, you abstract them away. If you build them in a modular fashion, those modules are something that you have direct control over and can be swapped out. And so I think that would probably be a great defense for obsolescence and what will invariably become obsolete in probably a shorter term if you build it otherwise.
And I think to that point, orchestration is where you're going to probably have the most deterministic code. It's doing routing, it's making decisions, it's integrating with other systems, whereas a lot of these other pieces are introducing a lot more probabilistic elements. And to me, I think those are the places where the rate of change is going to be the most rapid, and there's the most risk of sort of obsolescence. So again, if we have an orchestration layer, we can abstract away which model we're using. And if I want to switch from OpenAI to DeepSeek, it can be as simple as a configuration change.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Sam. And moving on to the next from Ruby Mancinelli. I hope I'm pronouncing everyone's name correctly as well. How does the speed to market factor into the build versus buy decision? Murray, I'd love to direct that to you.
Sure, but before I answer that question, whenever I hear the terms object-oriented and abstract away, It makes me think of the story of the crusty old programmer, of which Jeff certainly fits that bill.
I'm sure I
So
don't know what you're talking about.
I know. Right. So oftentimes in building systems, one of the most important considerations is the timeline or how long it's going to take to get the solution in place. Um, the theory being that when you buy something, you can get there faster than when you build it. The key there is working with your vendor or your open source community to understand how long something's going to take to implement versus projecting how long something's going to take to build. We all know that when somebody says something's 90% done, they're halfway there. And so we have to really be very careful in our predictions of what a project's going to look like when we're building something, especially when we're talking about something that's such new technology. And as Chris alluded earlier, right now there is a lack of talent. And so oftentimes that build decision is really important when time to market's a consideration. And so a lot of times I defer to buy just so I can get something faster, especially if it's not one of those critical components or one of those situations that's going to change often. What Jeff, the crusty old programmer, mentioned earlier, abstract that away, which is going to change. So you don't have one answer, but time to market is a very valuable consideration that often leads you to want to buy something before you build it.
I will say with that though, if you're in kind of a pilot mode, that's an opportune place to build because you can have a very sort of narrow and limited scope to just prove some concept or prove some value. In those scenarios, buying is probably going to lock you into a contract and more cost than you're really ready for. So I think, if I'm sort of in a pilot mode, I'm probably building or I'm probably trying to get into the least constraining sort of buy agreement that I can have.
Thank you for that. Next question is coming from Sam Huppert again. You described how small organizations might account for maintaining an AI solution and the challenge that you'll need to tackle. What differences are there when you approach maintaining an AI solution from a buy perspective in terms of response quality and accuracy?
You want to run with that one, Jeff?
I'm going to pass that to you, Chris.
Okay. So the challenge there is always when you're talking about a platform that you've built, you're dependent on the capabilities that they offer. And so I was talking to Able when I was at Gartner, and they're of course a pretty big and well-known player now. Their model, the way that they run their systems is they spin up a model and then they fine tune it in production, essentially, right? And so they're always doing what we call reinforcement learning through human feedback to make it better. And that's one way to do it. I'm not a huge fan of that especially for smaller cases where you don't necessarily have a huge amount of usage to really get that feedback. And so I tend to lean more towards curated RAG platforms. So like you might use something like a custom question answering service that is essentially a knowledge base, and you can use inference on the question side and then just return back the appropriate answer. And that gives you a high level of accuracy sort of out of the gate. And then the other piece of it is I think it's incredibly important to have a QA model in place. Whether you build or buy, you should have some way to test that and run questions against it. I advocate having like a gold standard set of questions. And, again, that's sort of chat based, but it's similar concept for, any other type of ML or AI that you're doing. Have a gold standard set of, for this input, this is what I would expect for the output. And in fact, we built a harness that allows us to do that very quickly at scale so that we can test changes and see how they evolve over time.
To add one thing to that, Chris, so I can piggyback off, off your answer. Regardless of building or buying, the importance of monitoring, I don't think could be underscored strongly enough. If after you have a solution in place, if you're not watching that solution and doing so in an empirical way, you're going to be unaware of something called model drift. It was a point earlier in slides that we didn't get a chance to talk on, but when your responses become inaccurate, especially actually in a buy scenario where you have very little visibility into what's going on behind the scenes, that's an important consideration that needs to be accounted for.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more questions left.
And I think that actually sets up Walt Simon's question pretty good. Is you mentioned using success metrics to help navigate the build versus buy. What would be some of those examples of those metrics?
Yeah, I mean, it again is going to be very use case dependent, but let's just take the example of a customer support chatbot. Probably the most important metric there is accuracy. And so a lot of times we implement feedback mechanisms where somebody can say whether that response was helpful or not. You can abstract some of those, so you might have some sort of a CSAT score, like a net promoter score or something like that you're using, and so you can collect that data and tie it to customer satisfaction. But you have to have a path from CSAT back to the system that you implemented so that you can measure the difference. Other times it's going to be a question of cost. If one system is extraordinarily more costly than another, you're going to want to evaluate that and pick the right one. But then on the other hand, you really have to think about, like, at Gartner, they had a great quote where they were saying the average productivity gain from AI, like productivity AI, is about 45 minutes a day. And what are you going to do with that 45 minutes? Because most people are just going to go get another coffee, or chat around the water cooler. And so those places, it becomes really important to try to find the key things that you're expecting that system to improve and find the most valuable metric for that. And it might actually require you to record that or monitor that or send that to some analytics system where you can really get that information.
And we've got one more question. I know we're at 2:00 on the dot right now, but what's an example from Jonathan Redding? What's an example of the orchestrator? Are there existing tools that already manage those kinds of complex integrations, or is that meant to represent something custom?
It's kind of both. I will, just because we don't have a lot of time, I will pitch Semantic Kernel. I love it. It's Microsoft's kind of open source-ish platform. It works with .NET, C#, and also works with Python. And it's an incredibly robust platform for building orchestration without having to sort of build all of that back-end wiring.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. We hope this provided you with some perspective, some valuable insights into the build versus buy decision for AI systems. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Once this closes, once you close the window, there'll be a survey. We'd really appreciate you guys going ahead and filling that out. Feel free to reach out at any time to set up more time to chat, or if you have any additional questions, we'll be sending a follow-up, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. We'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.